Well, hello, everybody. My name is Patricia McCoy, and I am the faculty director of the Rappaport Center for Law and Public Policy. Today, I am excited to welcome you to a very intriguing panel discussion with the futurist name of Flying Cars, Drones, and the Future of Law. Today's panel brings me back to my childhood. My brothers and I were hooked on the Saturday morning cartoons. Two cartoon shows stood out because they featured time travel. One of them was the Flintstones, and it took us back to life in prehistoric times. I can still hear Fred Flintstone going, "Yabba dabba doo!" And the other, the Jetsons, imagined how space-age families would live. We were riveted by the Jetsons because the United States was at the dawn of our own space station. And most riveting at all, the Jetson family traveled in a flying car, which fascinated me no end. So little did I think that decades later, the flying car would be a serious topic of discussion at last. This unique panel discussion was organized by our own Rappaport Center Senior Fellow, Alex Peña. Alex is a member of the class of 2018 here at Boston College Law School and will be moderating today's panel. Alex brings a wealth of experience, including in the New York State Senate, as a staff member, 2 big law firms, presidential campaigns, voter protection drives, and today as Executive Vice President of the Partnership for New York City. But today, I would like to focus on his unique expertise in transportation of the future and transportation law. During the Biden administration, Alex served as Associate General Counsel at the U.S. Department of Transportation, where he worked with Pete Buttigieg. There he was involved in cutting-edge transportation initiatives. Subsequently, he continued his transportation work at the law firm of Hogan Lovells. Fast forward to the present, Alex is the in-house expert for all things transportation at the Partnership for New York. There he has worked on a series of transportation initiatives, including New York City's successful campaign to adopt congestion pricing for drivers in Lower Manhattan, the Hudson Tunnel Project, and most recently, autonomous vehicles. His vision and insights will make for a fascinating discussion today. Before I forget, today's event is being recorded. And with that, let me turn the panel over to Alex Peña, who will introduce our star-studded group of speakers. Thank you so much.
Can everybody hear me? Thank you, Professor. Welcome to Flying Cars, Drones, and the Future of Law. Advanced aviation is no longer science fiction. It's becoming real, legal, and policy advancement of this era. Lawyers, legislators, and regulators are now confronting a new generation of aircraft entering the national airspace. What makes this such a real legal topic is the questions are not just about whether these aircraft can fly. They're about who gets to decide how they fly, where they land, and what risks are acceptable. This is a moment when the law is not just reacting to technology, it is actively deciding what the next generation of transportation will look like. The experts gathered here to my left have been at the center of it all, and I'm thrilled to introduce them. So, starting directly to my left and proceeding, Lauren Hartline is an attorney for next generation airspace company called Joby Aviation, where I actually had the pleasure of visiting, where her work focuses on aviation, business, regulation, safety, and policy. Previously, she served as Aviation Regulatory Counsel for the global UAS company, which stands for Uncrewed Aerial Systems, a company called Zipline, and General Counsel Director of Safety and Regulatory Affairs for the General Aviation Manufacturers Association, which is the trade organization for companies in this space. Lauren is an instrument-rated commercial pilot and lives in Maryland with her very patient partner. He's also a pilot. To Lauren's left is Desi Gibson. Desi is the Director of Policy at Merlin Labs, where she leads policy and regulatory strategy for autonomous aviation technology. She brings expertise from the Federal Aviation Administration, along with a background in telecommunications law, space policy, and international legal frameworks, including work on unmanned traffic management and drones beyond the visual line of sight, which basically means, you can fly the drone, but you can no longer see what you're flying. Desi holds a JD with a concentration in international law from the University of Baltimore School of Law and Bachelor of Arts from Georgetown University. She is also an active member of the International Institute of Space Law and several other aviation associations. Directly to Desi's left is Robin Grace, who serves as Chief of Advanced Air Mobility Integration and Strategy at the Massachusetts Department of Transportation Aeronautics Division, where she is responsible for advancing the integration of emerging aviation technologies across the state. A former United States Air Force pilot, she has extensive experience in both manned and unmanned aviation operations, as well as public sector program leadership. Her work brings together infrastructure, operations, and policy to support the next generation of air transportation. And finally, to the left of Robin is Paige Scott-Reed, who is a partner at Principal L, where she recently returned after serving as Chief Legal Counsel to Governor Maura Healey. Prior to that, Paige was instrumental in establishing Mass Autonomy, a nonprofit dedicated to advancing next-generation aviation in Massachusetts. She also served as Corporate Secretary and General Counsel to the Organizing Committee for Boston's 2024 Olympics bid, and served as the Chief Legal Officer for Mass DOT and MBTA. Paige is a member of the Rappaport Center, as I asked before. So as you can see, this is an extremely talented panel, and one that I'm very proud to be moderating today. So we're going to get right to it. And the typical panels go, we're going to cover an array of topics to give you some background and then hopefully inspire some questions at the end, both for folks in the room and of course for joining remotely. So to start with the basics, Laura, I'm going to direct this question to you. And I'm going to put it simply, and then I'm going to go into details, which is what's happening up in the sky right now? What new innovations, what new entrants are we seeing with respect to air vehicles? What type of technologies are there out there that raise the most interesting questions for lawyers and the public right now?
Thank you, Alex, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. This is really fun, and I feel really privileged to have the opportunity to speak with such wonderful and knowledgeable panelists. It's a really fun and exciting time to be an aviation lawyer. There's a lot going on. So you probably have heard maybe things about new entrants or maybe the phrase advanced air mobility. Anybody heard advanced air mobility? Anybody heard of Joby? Got one. You're my favorite. So I work for a company called Joby. We're a next generation aerospace company. We're based out in California, and since 2009 we've been working on an aircraft type called an electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, an eVTOL. Aviation loves acronyms. I'm going to try to do my best not to use them too often, but you're probably going to hear us use the word eVTOL. eVTOLs can take off and land like a helicopter vertically, and then they're capable of flying, transitioning to wing-borne flight and flying like an airplane. Our aircraft can fly wing-borne at up to speeds of 200 miles per hour, and it's very, very quiet because it's all electric and designed with that sensitivity in mind. We also have a lot of folks working on new drone technologies right now. I used to work for a company called Zipline. Anybody heard of Zipline? Zipline started out delivering medical products by drone in Africa. And they've expanded to doing work here in the U.S. Other folks in that space include Wing. Maybe you've seen some videos of Amazon doing drone deliveries. So these are larger than the small drones that you might see for personal hobbyists or real estate, folks doing photos for home sales. These are larger aircraft that are actually being used in commercial operations for deliveries. So we're talking about all kinds of new technologies, new propulsion systems. So our aircraft is electric. A lot of the drones are electric. We're talking about new types of operations, delivering packages by drone. We're carrying people by aircraft. And we're also talking about new degrees of automation. So our aircraft, Joby's aircraft, is highly automated. It is piloted, but it has envelope protection, which means the aircraft itself is fly-by-wire and limits what the pilot could do to exceed the safe envelope of flight. The drones that Zipline flies, highly automated, largely without pilot intervention, remote pilot intervention. So all kinds of new opportunities that are coming into the aviation space and integrating into an airspace that is currently moving, Desi probably has the up-to-date number, but 44,000 people daily, 44,000 flights daily, and 2.9-ish million people every day in and out of US airports. So a lot of exciting technology.
So, as you all can tell, there were not a lot of hands. There were not a lot of hands in the room when we asked about, have you seen eVTOL pictures of like vertical takeoff vehicles and then they can move in the sky, right? Horizontally moving forward, right, and back and forth, these, but they're not as loud or as heavy, and they don't run on gas, on fuel like airplanes do or helicopters. And so it's important for us to understand, like, this is all happening, and the fact that most folks don't know about it is the exact reason I made this panel. Because where you all sit in your positions as you're navigating law school and you're looking at litigation, transaction, regulatory law, and seeing where the world is going, you might knee-jerk and think that, the only one area that's in the tech space that's something that's available for lawyers to dive into outside of traditional lawyers policy might be AI. But I would encourage you to look at transportation as another space in which you can actually get yourself involved in any of those three categories: transactional, regulatory, or litigation. For the reasons you're about to learn today about just how dynamic it truly is. So Lauren, you explained a little bit about the types of aircraft that exist and kind of how the private sector is looking at it. You have package, there's obviously hobby people who can fly drones for hobbies, right? Hobbies, and they're smaller and you can fly in your backyard. But I think what you were talking about was package delivery, commercial flight, right? You also talked about obviously, eVTOLs, air taxis. Hopefully at one point down the line, 5-10 years from now, we get to the point where you can actually make it commercialized and out to scale to fly actual people, right? In these eVTOL vehicles, and then you have the autonomous aspect of it, where some of these flights do not need an actual pilot in the flight, or they can actually just run on automation remotely from a program. But I guess the natural question becomes, who regulates all this, and who takes a look at safety and risk, and what does it actually mean? And is this a new thing, or is it part of something that exists, and how we're regulating? So I think that you'd be appropriate to answer that question, given not only your expertise in this field, but also spending time at the FAA.
Thank you, Alex. Also, and to carry on with what you were saying, just thank you all for allowing me to be here. Thank you for this opportunity. This is very, very exciting. And I am privileged to be part of this illustrious panel. I will say very quickly, I work for a company, as Alex said, called Merlin Labs. What we are doing, which is a little bit different than Joby or Zipline, is we're putting automation, which would be an automated flight system into a pre-existing aircraft, and that can be agnostic to the aircraft itself. Meaning, if you have a Cessna, or let's say a jet, a King Air, whatever it is, what our technology is we're building what's called the Merlin Pilot, which is a flight system, a software stack that literally flies the plane, and can be used to either autonomously fly the plane or to have to in conjunction with a pilot, be there as to make the operation safer. We're flying already in the United States, and we also have flights in New Zealand as well. And I'll add on just a little bit to what you were saying, is that I think the really interesting things, you guys might not have seen maybe package delivery drones around here, but package delivery drones and this overarching, the new entrance systems are already flying. They're already in existence. This isn't something that we're talking about in 5 to 10 years. it's happening right now. And there's different areas of the country where it's happening more, you know. I live in DC, Washington, DC. It's not happening there. Because you can't fly a drone in Washington, D.C. But you know what? If you go to Texas, Virginia, there are other places where this is more prevalent. And that actually goes back to what Alex, to your actual question of who has the authority and where is that happening. And the FAA, who I used to work for, has the authority for safety and efficiency in the air. And I will talk about this very shortly. I know we're probably going to get into it later on. But how do we feel about preemption here? Who do you're all, I don't know what if you, are these what else? What is my audience here? Oh, it's all over the place. Okay. I'm literally going to ask, can anyone tell me about preemption? Any of the students? And what that means? Really? Yeah. What about you?
Me?
Yeah.
Preemption is when there's a federal and a state statute. The federal statute is the statute that is controlling.
That's perfect. That's it. That's the easiest way to say it. So, yeah. Thank you so much. You made me nervous. You got that. Yeah. Okay. So what that means is Congress has given the FAA the authority for safety and efficiency of the navigable airspace of the United States. And what that means is so if a law that a state is trying to put in place has anything to do with safety or efficiency, and then it's going to be preempted by the authority of the FAA. Okay? We'll talk about that later on and what that means. You know, what else do I need to talk about, Alex? Yeah.
I think just explaining very briefly, like, by regulating, what does that mean? So there's folks in DC, there's air traffic, so things like that.
Sure, yeah. Sure. Okay, so what does that actually mean? So, I always tend to go back to authority, so I'll say that again. So Congress has imbued the FAA with these authorities. The FAA then makes regulations out of these, and those regulations can be, actually, you know what, I should say this too. Anybody know what an aircraft is? How about you back there? Yeah. Aircraft? Okay, so, and that's actually, it's a really big question, because if the FAA is regulating things like aircrafts, right? What is an aircraft? Is a drone an aircraft? Is eVTOL an aircraft? What does that mean? I want to say it was 2012, I might be wrong about this, but the Congress came back in it was the FAA Modernization Act, actually, yeah, and literally said any entity that is flying in the air, in the navigable airspace, is an aircraft, and that aircraft is going to be subject to the regulations of the FAA. What that means is that there's, if you're thinking about a traditional aircraft, just this regular Cessna out there, right? There are a lot of different safety regulations that are going to be involved in that. Those regulations can be anything from for training from a pilot. It can be around the actual aircraft itself, to, let's say, medical certificates that a pilot might need to have. Well, if all of those regulations are attached to a Cessna, to an aircraft, what does that mean if you have a drone, a pilotless drone? Does that pilot on the ground, who is not sitting there, still need to have a medical certification, right? So what the FAA looks at is first, because everything is going to be considered an aircraft that's up in the air, right? So you have this overarching, it's first an aircraft. And then, with these new entrance vehicles, you are then looking at that, and the FAA is taking away and modifying what parts of these regulations need to be modified for these new entrance aircrafts. I feel like I'm going on and on and on,
No,
and probably can go from here.
So I think, it needs to be covered because as we get to the rest of the conversation, there's about questions, you have to understand the foundation, right? I think like the FAA looks at, you look up, right? You look at a navigable airspace, look at the sky, and you think about like what goes into regulating that. FAA is the housing agency that does that. But then when we look at the sky, you have to say, okay, what levels at the sky? How many feet up is the risk here? How many feet up is the risk there, right? So they look at that. Obviously, airplanes don't fly at the same as helicopters. The helicopters not flying at the same, but the drones right next to each other. So you got to look at like where they fall. Then you got to look at who's in it or who's not in it. Then you have to look at what it's carrying or what it's not carrying. Is it hazardous or not hazardous, right? How fast is it going? And then you got to look at who to the point of the pilot, whether you're actually in it or you're remotely piloting it, what type of certifications are required for that. All about risk, right? And I think that's something that I want to make sure folks have kind of keep in mind. I just talk a little bit more about this.
Oh, can I pop in with that, actually? Thank you. Yeah, I'll pop in real close, or real quick about that. Does it do it? Okay. So the FAA has developed, especially for these new entrance vehicles, what they consider their safety risk continuum. And that is kind of, if you can think about that, on the lower end of that might be, should have the lowest regulatory burden and also should be the easiest to get for the FAA to get working, let's say, is, it's not, but it should be, is something that has, that provides very little risk to the public, and that might be a very, very small drone that is being flown in visual sight, meaning that the pilot on the ground is going to be able to see, the pilot in command is going to be able to see the drone the entire time. And that might be in a space where there isn't anybody else there, right? Going up that safety risk continuum, the next level, and the FAA has already regulated that, there's already regulations, it's called Part 107 for that. The next up, we're going to be looking at commercial, let's say, drones that are a little heavier, that might be flying in a different area, and then might be also flying beyond visual line of sight, meaning that the pilot in command can no longer see where the drone is going. The FAA sees that as a little heavier risk, so there's a higher regulatory burden to that. There's a rulemaking currently in any day, it will be published, any day, the FAA has gotten to a point where a rulemaking is about to come out for that. And if you go up that safety risk continuum, the next thing I would say is mosaic, really, if you want to go on from there.
Actually, can we?
Yeah, we can move on from that.
I want to work in the state's angle and the community angle. So I think understanding what this is, right? You understand the technologies now. We're talking about aircraft, that they're new entrants, right? Then you have, okay, well, how is the federal government looking at risk? And they have a statute that's pretty, you look at preemption, safety and efficiency in the sky. I mean, if you think about, you're what, a week and a half away from finals? If you get that in the final, and a hypo, and you say, the federal aviation regulates safety and efficiency in the sky, and then we give you a question about if a state does this or a manufacturer does this, what happens? Just think about it from that perspective and how fascinating that area of law is. So, that brings me to Robin, and if we're talking about the federal government having such a massive role in this very technical space, a space that carries immense risk, what important decisions are still being made by states and cities when it comes to this type of aviation?
All right, thank you, Alex, for that question, and good afternoon to you all. Thank you for having me. Just to touch on something that Alex said earlier, first of all, good luck on your finals. But as you're thinking about what area you want to go into, and I do bring the transportation lens, I can't help it, we do hope to inspire you to think about getting involved in this space because we will always need transportation. It is such an important part of how we move. It's such a vital part of our economy, and people are always going to need to move. We're always going to need to move cargo and people. So we're always going to need that niche expertise, and we really need smart people to help us figure out a lot of the regulatory questions that are going to be coming up in the future. We've thrown a lot of you today. Autonomy, the federal oversight of the airspace. How do we measure risk? So there's a lot of important questions that need to get answered to enable these technologies. And while we're talking about the future, we're like, great, there's so much amazing technology out there, the flying cars and new ways to move people. If we don't get the regulatory aspects right, it's all going to come to a screeching halt. So it's a really, really important aspect of all this. So now to get to the state perspective, I've been working with the state for about 6 years. I started out with their drone operations program, and now I've been involved with advanced air mobility for 2 years. And it's such an exciting space. So we learned a lot about the FAA. The FAA owns the airspace. They control who goes in and out of the airspace. They also certify the aircraft. At the state and local level, we really want to concentrate on how do we implement these technologies in a practical way, and how do we integrate these in our transportation systems in a practical way so that they work for the people? How do we engage with the communities? What does the permitting look like around these technologies? What kind of infrastructure is needed to support these technologies? And we talked about the Jetsons very early on. I don't always like that analogy because it's not going to look exactly like the Jetsons. But we really need to think about where these new technologies are going to take off and land from. And in order to do that, we need to have a lot of things in place. So one is infrastructure. And I want to talk a little bit about the infrastructure because this is something that is very much in the state's lane. We talked about electric aircraft. I'm sure many of you know that our grid is already severely constrained. So we need to think a lot about what it means to compete with some of the other entities. We have AI centers that are going to want the grid. We have ground EV charging. What does all that look like, and how do we start to plan for that? We talked a little bit about permitting. So, early operations will probably go in and out of general aviation airports. We already have the infrastructure. People are used to aircraft going in and out of the general aviation airports, commercial airports like Logan. But what if we start to put up new vertiports or new heliports? What does that permitting look like? And who needs to be involved in these conversations? We also have environmental permitting that happens at the state level. So I think one of the first things that happens in communities when we do have conversations is it going to be noisy? So we need to have those conversations early, and then understanding, what the coordination needs to look like. So we talked about federal, we talked about state. There's also local authorities that need to be involved in this. And the part that keeps me awake at night is how all these entities are going to coordinate in an effective way to enable these technologies in a timely fashion. So I don't think it's the technology necessarily that's going to hold us back. I think it's getting all these other pieces in place. And that state is going to be very important in all that.
Thanks, Robin. That's a perfect segue. I started my career in state government, so definitely my favorite answer so far. No. So it's a perfect segue because there are so many things to keep in mind. And so states navigate this and want to do what's right for the people. We then think about what are the different advocacy points, right? Whether it is through direct political and taking advantage of the regulatory system and figuring out how to navigate it. I think, Paige, you're perfectly positioned to talk a little bit about, as not only chief counsel to the governor, but obviously overseeing MassDOT, legal. What does this look like from the vantage point of if you're either representing a company or you're a member of the public and you're like, what are the advocacy points? How does change happen? Are there statutes, are there regulations? How do you think about that when we think about advanced aviation, different advocacy points along the way?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Do you want to?
No. Thanks. Sorry. So, a little bit about me. I don't fly anything. I'm not a pilot. I knew very little about aviation when I became general counsel at MassDOT and the MBTA. I had no idea what kind of law a general counsel at the MBTA would be asked to handle. And it was one of the most interesting points in my career because you really get to understand what does government do. As a lawyer, a lot of the questions that come in front of you in state government have to do with who's going to do what, and that is certainly the case with respect to next generation aviation. So we talked a little bit about federal preemption, about the national airspace. I think most people think about the airspace as pretty far above their house, right? Airplanes fly pretty high, but actually, the way the law is written, airspace starts at the ground level. So technically speaking, the federal government controls everything that happens in the air from the ground all the way up. What does that mean for a government lawyer trying to figure out what to do with respect to next generation aviation? Well, you've seen lots of places where Newton, for example, tried to say no drones in this space whatsoever. You can't fly over this beach, you can't fly over this somebody's backyard. Well, federal preemption. So there was a court case, there was litigation, and lawyers fought about whether or not airspace still really begins at the ground level or it doesn't. Even once you get beyond litigation, states are faced with the question, who's going to do what? So for MassDOT, there are lots of places where we think the public has an interest in whether something happens or it doesn't happen. Should we get involved in that? I'll give an example. We've talked about airports. Traditionally, MassDOT Aeronautics Division is responsible for the safety of ground operations at airports throughout the state of Massachusetts. If what you're talking about are drones that are larger scale drones landing throughout your city and town, should aeronautics also be writing regulations about where you can have a takeoff and landing area? What if you're talking not just about a package size drone, but you're talking about an eVTOL, you're talking about Joby's aircraft, which is, you know,
Aircraft sized.
yeah, aircraft size. Think about a small airplane or a very large helicopter. They can take off and land without an airport. Does that mean that MassDOT Aeronautics should have regulations about where Joby can take off and land? I'm going to guess Joby might not like that to have too many of those regulations, but they would like to have permissions. So all of these are questions that lawyers are answering, and they're answering them both in terms of regulations and litigation, but they're also answering them in terms of contracts and partnerships. So in order for Joby to begin flying, they really need the assistance of government to say, yes, we would like you to fly from here to there, and we're going to learn from that flight. That's a role that government plays, and government lawyers write those agreements that say, yes, we're going to work with Joby to pilot a flight from here to there. This is what's going to happen with the information that comes from this. This is who is going to know about it. And then, Alex, you brought up community engagement. Government also plays a big role in convening the public, educating them about what is going on with the technology, and asking for feedback from the public about what should government be doing. And lawyers are involved in all of those processes. So a lot going on in this space.
Thank you, Paige.
Oh my God, I could not agree with Paige more, and I think folks like Joby and our other folks in that space are very, are engaging in all different levels of government to make sure that we're navigating those questions. One of the interesting things that I think you're probably hearing about advanced air mobility, about drones, about folks like Joby making eVTOLs, is that it is localizing aviation in a way that traditional aviation hadn't. So if you look at the US, there's some odd 500 commercial airports like Logan. There's some odd 5,000 public access airports, and then there's 19,000 landing sites throughout the US. These types of aircraft operations are going to bring aviation to communities in ways that traditional aviation hasn't. So there's going to be new types of operations, but also communities that hadn't previously been connected to aviation technology in the same ways. And that is, aviation has always required both federal and state and local engagement, but I think that's one of the ways that this is kind of shifting the narrative, because it's not the way that traditional aircraft had interacted like Paige mentioned, you know, you might have a drone delivering to your house, not an airport. Although I completely agree with Robin that early on, I think from folks in making passenger carrying aircraft like ours, you'll see operations from the traditional infrastructure initially as we look to develop new infrastructure opportunities.
You know, off that point, when I was working at Hogan Lovells, I was able to go represent Zipline. I was able to go to Arkansas, where there is a program, you know, obviously specific to that state, to that area, where Zipline is operating within a community and delivering packages upon request from regular people from their homes. They go online, on the website, in the local store, you press a button, and it arrives in whatever the 15 minutes that it sets as a target for itself, right? And people love it and they enjoy it. And it's very weird. It's like driving up and you see the launch site, like it's right there. There's an airport, right? But it's a tiny one, right? And it's obviously for that particular type of aircraft, which was in this case it would be the package delivery drone. And so that stuff's happening, right? It's not happening at scale. What we're trying to talk to is like how we're going to get to scale, but it's happening, and there are so many things that are implicated. I think it's been helpful where the conversation is going, because that's really what I think helpful for you all to keep in mind and think about what are the different entry points as a young lawyer, or even as in law school, exploring what this really means more broadly. So that brings us to the point that I think is most applicable to anybody who doesn't even have an aviation background, which, by the way, before I even worked at USDOT, I did not have an aviation background. I went into the general counsel's office. That, you know, there are different types of problems that can be solved. One big problem that requires lawyers and, more importantly, creative thinkers and people thinking about safety for the community is public trust. And how is this coming up and manifest, and how is this playing out, right? And so I think I'll leave for the conversation to kind of free flow depending on what your vantage points are, but I'd be curious to hear from you all a little bit about protecting safety and advancing public trust when it comes to this technology.
I might say something about that. So, you know, obviously these aircraft will be certified. So there will be, the FAA will go through their safety certification process. But beyond that, there's really the public perception. And I think that's something that's really, really important because when we first started this panel, we looked around and we said, who has heard of eVTOLs and who has heard of advanced air mobility? And nobody raised their hand unless you all are being shy, and that's fine too. So people don't really know about this. Now that you all have heard a little bit about it, how many of you are ready to jump into an eVTOL or an advanced air mobility aircraft?
I think we got one.
He's my new favorite.
I'll take it a step further. What if it's an autonomous aircraft?
Not yet.
Not yet. What about an autonomous ground vehicle? Waymo. Who would be excited if a Waymo pulled up? I'm going to be honest, I would too.
I just went on my first one and it was wonderful.
I've been in some scary Ubers through the years, so I'm all about the Waymo. But I think it's really important that we have these conversations with the community because you know, these eVTOLs are going to start flying here shortly. And I think it's really important that, you know, one, they are going to be safe aircraft, but that, you know, from a perspective of the community, that we really convey that. And as we're going through these conversations, we get the feedback. And also, you know, it's something as a state government, we want to enable these type of operations because we see a lot of potential. It's a new way to move people. I mean, I don't know how many of you have driven to the Cape, but every time I drive out there, I'm like, there has got to be a better way. So I think there's real world applications for this. But it's important as we go through this that we skirt that fine line between enabling these operations and making sure that we understand what the risk continuum is, because the public perception of this is going to be everything. So I just wanted to kind of point that out.
Yeah, and picking up on that, there's a connection between experience and belief in the safety of a new technology. There's also a connection between trust and transparency around what do we know and what do we not know about a new technology, and all of those concepts come into play when you're trying to build a new industry, turn a new infrastructure over to industry to use for a new technology. One of the things that government really brings to the conversation is to fill in some of those gaps. So with respect to experience, what are the ways in which we can safely allow the public to experience new technologies early in the process so that they understand it's great to say flying cars and have the Jetsons pop into your head, but that's not really what we're talking about. So what are we really talking about? Robin and I had the chance to go to Paris at one point and see some of these technologies up close because of work that the government there was doing around the Paris Olympics and trying to give the public experience of electric aircraft, aircraft that eventually are going to be autonomous or could be optionally piloted, but that right now are still being flown by pilots, so that you have a sense of what is it that we're, like, how big is this thing? How noisy is it? How safe does it feel when you're in it? All of those experiential pieces of learning, the government has a big role in making possible before you have permanent regulations out there. So I guess I think real world, experiential, and then transparent about what it is that you know and what it is that you're still learning. I think that's a lot of what MassDOT has been trying to do in terms of moving Massachusetts continually forward in terms of being a place that would be welcoming for new technologies that are safe and that are going to bring some actual benefit to the public.
Hopping on that, and specifically the word public benefit, I think there are a lot of cool, really interesting new technologies that are out there. And sometimes, I think part of all of our jobs up here, I know specifically part of my job, is explaining to the public as well that some of there are some benefits that we might not. It's not just that it's cool getting your coffee delivered by drone, right? There's so many other applications. Zipline, delivering vaccines, delivering in Africa. I think at one point, do you know how many deliveries?
We don't have it anymore as current, but it was three-digit.
It was a three-digit number, yeah, of delivering blood and vaccines in Africa, right? I can say, from Merlin's perspective on our product roadmap on the civil side, there are a lot of different applications that we're going forward with, and they are agriculture spraying, they are firefighting as well. Right now, if you are firefighting by plane, you can only do that during the day. At night, the fire still happens. There's no way by plane to safely do that at night. An autonomous plane can. I believe the highest amount of accidents for private pilots are in agriculture.
It's a very high rate.
It's a very high rate. Now, if we can make that safer, if we can have applications that, technologies that come in and make that safer. When I first got to the FAA, one of the examples that was given to me, which I had no idea about, is infrastructure inspection. So the specific case that was given to me is in Texas. There are, well, it actually wasn't pipeline. It was talking about the pipeline inspection as well. But talking about electricity.
The line
inspection. The way line inspection was happening for many years was that someone was in a helicopter, and there was a person hanging off the helicopter looking at the line, and that's how we did it. Unbelievably dangerous. It can be done by drone. It can be done autonomously, right? How can we make, there are a lot of things, and I'll actually say this, and this is personal, and I'm just going to say this very quickly. When I was a child, most people, I think you guys, anybody remember Hurricane Andrew? A lot of you weren't born yet, okay. So I grew up in South Florida. I was in Hurricane Andrew at the time. We had weeks without water. oh, this is gonna make me emotional, right? We had, there was no way to get to us. Half my house was gone, it was horrifying, right? So we had the National Guard, oh my God, this is really, yeah, but we had the National Guard come in and have to deliver food and ice and water and things like that. It took days. What if that was done autonomously, right? That's something we can fix. We have the technology now to do it. So what I like to think about with this is, and we say in my company, the dirty, dangerous, and dull jobs, but we also think about, like, there's a lot of applications of changing hearts and minds that are really, really important that can be done now. So anyway, I will continue with that, and I will not talk about my trauma. Here we go. Yeah.
First off, thank you for sharing that, and thanks for the conversation here. I think it's important to keep hearing the real-world application behind the cool regulatory standpoint and the highly advanced technical standpoint of all this that's going on. I will give a couple examples, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. If there's no questions, I'll go back to questions here. But I want to give another example, a variation of that. So when it comes to fighting wildfires, right, how can we prevent them? How can we aggregate data quicker? NASA is working with the private sector to try to figure that out with drones, right? An example, you took about Hurricane Andrew. I got to visit, when I was working at Golden Levels, the Choctaw Nation in Oklahoma. The Choctaw Nation, obviously a historic tribal nation in Oklahoma, they are championing the usage of uncrewed aircraft systems, i.e. drones, for tribal governments to serve as a model for how to navigate their territory, which is rigorous terrain. I was able to drive through it in like a mountain vehicle to get through their terrain and see how difficult it is to get to the places that these historic tribes are obviously their land they're living in. So how do you deliver not only food and regular product, but also medical supplies? Even the process of sending blood samples back, right, takes way longer than it would if you went to the doctor, you got your blood drawn to figure out if something was wrong with you. That would be instantaneous, right? And communities that didn't have the same issues that they deal with, but sometimes it takes days in tribal nations. Drones are trying to solve that, right? And I think when we think about, where, a baseline about transportation issues we've been alluding to, eventually at some point we got to figure out how to navigate the busy urban centers around airports, right? And that'll be a long-term goal to alleviate traffic there, on the ground traffic and whatnot. And so these are like real-world applications to give you guys an idea that like you don't need to be a pilot or an aviation expert to get into it. These are real-world problems that are going to exist for the foreseeable future and need motorsports. So with that, does anybody have any questions on any of these things? We'd be happy to engage.
Thank you for asking questions.
Yeah, seriously.
Hi, my name's Andrew Boy. I have a quick question. I wrote it down, and I can't find it. All right, I found it. So I had it put to me that flying cars already exist. We call them helicopters. But helicopters aren't really looked at that way because they're high cost in two ways. They are difficult to learn how to fly, which creates a learning cost, which then creates a monetary cost because there's a limited availability of helicopters and helicopter pilots. So how does the technology that you folks are here talking about today address those two costs that have limited other technologies in the past?
I can take this from an eVTOL standpoint, and that is an excellent question. Very, very thoughtful, thank you. So you targeted one aspect of it being pilot training. Helicopters are not only difficult to learn to fly, they don't always want to stay in the air. They're a remarkable machine, but they are inherently unstable. So eVTOLs are aiming to reduce pilot costs for training by being a much more simple aircraft to fly. So even though our aircraft is capable, an aircraft like Joby's is capable of flying like a helicopter and also flying like an airplane, when you operate this aircraft, the aircraft is translating very simple commands from what you want into what 6 different power unit stations propellers are doing. It's something that an individual pilot couldn't actually control by themselves. So the aircraft is called fly-by-wire. It's translating that across. It's simplified vehicle operations is the term the industry uses for it. It's a very simple training process We throw folks in our simulator and they can fly it within 15, 20 minutes. And you tell it, I want to go fast, slow, you want to tell it, I want to go up, down, and the aircraft translates all of that into what the system needs to do to act on your command. So the training modules are really focused on teaching you what to do in more emergency situations. It's a much easier aircraft to fly than flying a helicopter. They're also being designed thoughtful to another aspect that helicopters are really expensive on is maintenance. A lot of moving parts, very difficult to maintain, very expensive. A lot of eVTOLs are being designed to be thoughtful to that. I know the drone operators were also thinking about that. Modular parts that can be replaced for something that's easier to do that way, fewer moving parts, fewer things to maintain, and all of these things are aiming at making this aviation sector accessible to more communities when it's at scale. Of course, we've got to get to that point, but a couple of points on that. I don't know.
The only thing I would add in is, do you want to keep going?
Yeah, I want to
Yeah,
get more questions.
Did I abbreviate anything there? Sorry.
No, you're good. So, I know we have some questions, so I want to make sure we get to them as well.
Hey, thanks guys for coming in. So my question is about, public policy with this, obviously. You guys are all pretty heavily gung-ho that this is good for public, but the way I see it is, I can definitely imagine a world like where we're looking up at the sky and we're seeing all of our millionaire neighbors like flying over our heads, and we're like, gosh darn this nuisance. Yeah, they're probably quiet, but when you're moving that much air, they can't be that quiet, right? So my question is is this something that we should be investing public money in from MassDOT, or should we really be focusing on trains and things that can move the masses?
So there's a lot in that question, and absolutely one of the challenges for state government is just because a new technology is coming doesn't necessarily mean that the benefits outweigh the costs. I think one of the reasons why you hear so many people on the panel gung-ho about what's coming is that there's some challenges that right now are hard to address. So if you think about not flying cars, but just aviation the way we traditionally think about it, there are places where it's very hard to get access to aviation because there aren't that many people who live there. It doesn't make sense for JetBlue to fly there. These kinds of technologies might make aviation available for those communities in a way that's not available right now. So you can be heavily in favor of the introduction of Joby's aircraft without also being in favor of private individuals owning a lot of them and using them for their own transportation from place to place. And that conversation about where in this development of a technology should we go is the heart of what government lawyers are asked to do every day. So thank you so much for your question. I think adding a couple of other things that government lawyers are trying to talk about at the same time. Robin touched on one a little bit, which is the transformation from traditional aviation to what we're calling advanced air mobility also involves this transition from fuel source, from traditional aviation fuel to electric vehicles. There are all sorts of questions around that. Yes, electric is going to be cleaner, and aviation fuel is a pretty nasty thing that people don't really like to be around. But as Robin pointed out, that produces a whole lot of other questions around how much electric infrastructure are we really going to have, and how much of it should be devoted to aviation versus other things that are falling on the electric grid. So I don't have a whole lot of answers, but you're asking exactly the right questions, and that's a big role for lawyers in this whole aviation space, is trying to figure out What information do we need to make those decisions? Who should be involved in making the decisions? Is it state? Is it federal? Is it local? And once we have some ideas about what the answer should be, how do we implement them? Do we implement them through infrastructure focus and what we fund, or do we implement them through regulation and what we allow, or do we implement them through partnerships and what we facilitate? So there's a lot there. Thank you for the question.
I will give a second for anybody that has another question, but on that point, it is an excellent commentary. When I was at USDOT as Associate General Counsel, which obviously is the in-house counsel for the Department of Transportation, we went out and we visited a number of eVTOL companies. And we asked them, in a variation of the question you asked, which is basically, what does this look like for everyday Americans? And what does this look like in terms of like, what problem are you solving for? Or is it going to be something that's going to be up above folks that people are not going to get mass benefit off of? We asked about cost, we asked about how many people, we asked about plans for scale, and then obviously getting into that type of information about what was disclosed, we were very confident that the companies in the space right now are thinking about that, in part because they're obviously doing it for public good, but also in part because, fortunately, the national airspace is heavily, heavily regulated, and the FAA, and by extension DOT, have a significant role to play in how these technologies advance and at what point and what hurdles they meet. And one of them is going to be affordability, and one of them is going to be mass general public interest. And that obviously comes from who's in the federal government at the time, as much as it comes from the state government. But for questions like yours, the federal government has a big role to play in terms of how to scale it out for people.
Cool.
Can I add just one thing to that as well? And I think we've been talking a lot about technology, and we don't want to have technology just for technology's sake. So I think it's what problems are we trying to solve? And there's a few things out there that government really needs to address. So access to healthcare. Are these kind of technologies going to solve it in and of themselves? No, but I think that they could be part of the problem. Desi gave a great example of, post-disaster. It can be very difficult to get vital supplies, the roads are down. Does this technology have a place in helping along those lines? I think definitely. We could even look at the cave, what happens when the winds exceed certain miles per hour and we can't get life-saving medication out, it has to be there right away. Could this technology help support that? I think the answer is potentially. So these are kind of the answers that we want to explore. It's not just a matter of making it more convenient to get to the cave, it's can these help solve some societal problems?
Excellent. Thank you all for being here. My question, I'd like a two-parter. The first one is with all this the new and exciting technology, and particularly in the autonomous kind of idea, is how do you account, or how does displaced workforces come into your considerations? Because Waymo or Uber, driverless Uber, that's going to displace an entire low-wage worker kind of industry, and especially in a gig economy. It might not be the primary source of income, but it's an important source of income, and I feel a lot of times there's a lot of excitement around kind of autonomous vehicles or aircraft and what they can do, that how do you weigh the costs and the benefits essentially, especially with the workers? And then kind of to a larger point, what you were saying about the federal, state, local, safety, environmental, balancing all those interests seems incredibly hard, and it's why this stuff takes sometimes, it moves slower than the actual technology. So what's a change, or if you had a magic wand to kind of speed up the process so that government policy can kind of stay with the technology and regulate it as it's evolving, what would that be?
Well, while you're thinking on that very complex two-part question, we can take one more question and then.
Okay, I'll jump in.
Autonomy, you're the right.
You do the
Yeah, so I'll say a few things. The first thing is the way, and I'm going to speak for Merlin first. The way Merlin is addressing this is we're actually not looking at going from piloted aircraft to unpiloted aircraft. We see this as what we look at as our product is something that would first have an assist for a pilot. So right now, we are and have been for a very long time on the Department of Defense side, and Department of War side, and also the civil side, we have a pilot shortage at this point. So there are more aircrafts and there's more want for something that honestly, there's not enough people trained to do those jobs. For Merlin, what we look at is how can we help that? How can we put something in place that assists pilots where you might be able to fly that aircraft and you're not having to have maybe as many people on, or what you're having to do is it's actually creating a safer journey for who's on board. So that's the first thing I would say.
They're trying to solve for humanity.
Yeah, exactly. Complementary and not replacement, right? And then going into the second part of, actually, if anybody else wants to pick up on that, yeah.
Yeah, and I wanted to jump into how difficult your question is. I know you sort of alluded to that, but I think you already heard from Desi's answer. It's not always clear that eliminating one job is eliminating jobs in general. So with respect to aviation, the real drive is to have operators rather than pilots, which in some level would really increase the availability of jobs and would lower the skill level, and so maybe make them more accessible. I'm not sure where I come out on Waymo, but my general experience has been there have been lots of transitions where we thought the computer is going to get rid of jobs. We won't need people because we're just going to have computers and they'll do all of it. When actually your experience is there are way more jobs now that we have computers, because actually you need developers, you need maintenance, you need, you can do some things that you couldn't do without computers, and so there are technologies that exist that wouldn't have existed. So it's a hard question. The reason I'm not sure where I come out on it is the character of those jobs is often different. So, I was intimately involved in the regulatory change that allowed Uber and Lyft to operate in Massachusetts. And there was some real displacement of folks who are lower wage, who had invested a lot in getting to have a taxi cab battalion, for example. And so to glance over the displacement that a new technology can bring about, I think, is a mistake. That being said, I don't think it's a one-to-one question, and it's really hard to predict whether on balance a new technology is going to be good or bad with respect to the goal that you've sort of set forth, which is having good, high-quality jobs for a majority of people in the community, not just for the few. I think particularly with respect to some of the changes we're seeing in next generation aviation, those questions are even less clear than in the autonomous vehicle space, because there are all kinds of jobs that are being created by the fact that you now are able to think about flight at a level that is less intense than an aircraft or a helicopter, and you're thinking about flight in terms of a vehicle that maybe can carry 1 or 2 people rather than 12, or they can carry 12 but on a shorter leg, or they can carry, that doesn't carry people at all and yet serves a function. So there's just, it's a lot changing all at once. I share your worry, but I'm not sure that the evidence suggests that actually what we're seeing is a lessening of jobs, or that they're moving upwards on the difficulty scale. I think actually there's a lot that's being generated in the day-to-day space. If you think about remote pilots in command of inspection vehicles, those are often firefighters and people who would be policemen or EMTs who now have a new, or engineers who have a new space and a new set of job opportunities. So it's just not entirely clear to me.
I think we have time for one short question. over there.
Hi, thank you for speaking with us. You spoke a lot about physical security concerns, and I'm wondering, especially as this probably or already has moved into the defense sector or national security sphere, how cybersecurity concerns come into play, because it's hard to imagine a hacker wanting to take control of a drone delivering someone's coffee, but what happens when a plane is involved in a military operation and a really advanced bad actor wants to attack a foreign adversary? Are we thinking about that, or is that way further down the line?
Absolutely. Yeah. I'll actually hop in and on two levels. The defense side, Merlin is in the defense side as well, so we are definitely thinking about that. That's huge. I'm going to actually come back for a second and say I was very involved in the current rulemaking that is out at the FAA, which is on the civil side, that would enable package delivery drones and things like that. So even on that side, on the civil side of things, in those regulations, we specifically put in cybersecurity protocols that you had to have certain parts of cybersecurity in place to be able to operate. And that's because for that regulation specifically, what would be operating is what we consider highly autonomous. So it might not be that you are a pilot in command of one drone. It might be that you are a pilot in command of 20, 100 drones, right? So even on the, let's say worst case scenario, you took over 20 or 100 package delivery drones coming out of Walmart, that's a big deal, right? So cybersecurity and actually the physical security of the drone itself and what it can fly over, where it can come from, who has the ability to even put things onto that drone from the get-go is also something that the FAA is definitely thinking about, the federal government is thinking about, the Department of Defense is thinking about, all the way down. And there's a number of regulations working their way through for the FAA side that are dealing with also the security of drones itself, or themselves.
Before I hand it over to Amanda, I want to stay on that question too, just to keep folks in mind thinking about different access points, advocacy, what security looks like. There's also Congress, right, that has to think hard and has been for the last several years about how they're regulating manufacturing of these parts, right? Places of origin, who owns these companies, what percentage, what is certified at what level. These are things that are happening right now and currently being debated. And that's an area of interest. That is the point. That is the place where the real change can happen if you believe that, there's concerns there. So from an advocacy standpoint, from a legal standpoint, that's another place as well.
So I think we should have titled this panel Up in the Air, not just because of the technology we've been discussing, but really what's up in the air seems something bigger, which is how law and policy are responding to not only what is possible, but how they help shape what is preferable. And that to me is a really important reason why this feels like such a welcome conversation. For those people who are on Zoom and also the students who came here today, we are now understanding how the law remains deeply, deeply human, no matter what the technology is. There is space for judgment, for collaboration, for ethical reasoning, all the things that AI is never going to really replace for us. And I think, I just want to, first of all, thank all of our panelists for modeling that so clearly for us. And especially for Alex for sharing his expertise this whole week. Not only in expertise in the space, but for engaging our students in how to think, not just what to know. And I think that's really, really important and why we have the Senior Fellowship. And I just want to add one quiet note, which is, I'm not usually polemical, but I see that there are lots of students who have come here today, despite the fact that I know you're really worried about finals, there's so much going on. And I think at a time when students are really being asked to make decisions much earlier and earlier about what their careers are going to be, seemingly for the rest of their lives, spaces like this really matters, and access to leaders like Paige, Robin, Desi, Lauren, and Alex really, really matter because you're creating room for curiosity. You're also creating room for exploration and for exploring paths that are beyond what we can even imagine right now, especially in law school, but right now in 2026, we can't even imagine these paths. And I just want to thank all of you for your expertise, for your generosity of time, but also for just demonstrating for us that it is really, really meaningful right now to make space for what can be possible. So thank you all. We really, really appreciate you. And thank you to all the students and everybody on Zoom for coming.